In the history of science, it's important to know not only what was known and by whom, but also where natural philosophy was studied, practiced, and distributed. What are the locales? The institutions that support and sponsor, make a home for learning of various sorts, including natural philosophy. Well, if you think about it, nowadays, very little scientific work is actually done outside the context of an institution or association of some type. And in the modern world, the varieties of these associations and institutions is quite broad. We have at one end, the Research Institute, which exists for the purpose of promoting research. We also have universities of various sorts, more or less interested in research or teaching, or both. There are also corporations that engage in scientific research for different goals, of course. But again, it's an institution that supports the work of individuals. We also have scientific societies, the National Academy of Sciences, for example, institutions that, again, bring people together in order to facilitate communication, to make a home for learning. Now, many, but not all, of the historical characters that we've dealt with so far in this course have belonged to one or another kind of an institution. In the ancient world, there was Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, both giving a lifespan to the idea of their founders, a place for students to gather, a place for work to be conducted and discussions to take place. Another example was the combination of the museum and the library in Alexandria, the first place that we saw an institution with royal patronage. And the library at Alexandria and the associated museum, mostly the library, survived for about 500 years. I haven't actually mentioned what happened to the Library of Alexandria because everybody, I should though, because everybody likes to blame everybody else for the destruction of the library. The fact is that probably it was destroyed about the year 270 AD when the Emperor Aurelian was trying to put down a rebellion. We know that there was heavy fighting in the city of Alexandria. The palace quarter, the palace precinct was devastated. And that's where the library happened to be. So that was probably the end of the library. I'm afraid there's not some great mythological story attached to it. It's rather pedestrian, but still tragic. In Islam, there were also institutions like the Baitul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, supported by the caliphs. But also in Islam, the mosque and the madrasa, madrasa being an Islamic school, also provided locations for the pursuit of intellectual culture, of intellectual affairs, including natural philosophy. We mentioned previously that Al-Hazan was connected with the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo for the last 18 years of his life. Well, now that we've moved to the Latin West, what was the locus for learning for natural philosophy, for all kinds of intellectual activity? Well, these were first the schools and later the universities. The schools developed along the lines of the Roman educational system that had been part of Latin culture since really the Roman Republic, so for quite some time. You'll notice, actually, before I go on talking about these schools and universities, that in many of the cultures we have dealt with, the function of education is closely related to religious institutions. So the mosque and the madrasa, the museum and the library in Alexandria, the cathedral, monastery, and school in medieval Europe. So there's a very close connection between intellectual life and religious life traditionally. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the 9th century Carolingian edict that ordered that all all monasteries and cathedrals established schools was slow to take effect. Nonetheless, it did in a big way in the 11th and 12th centuries. Now, the teaching in these schools was based largely on the traditional 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium. But there was a considerable amount of local variation in terms of the emphasis that was put on various parts of the trivium and the quadrivium, or the general philosophical tenor of the discussions or even the purpose for the education. What I'd like to do then now is to look at two particular schools of the early 12th century that had their heyday in the first half of the 1100s. The first one is the school connected to the Cathedral of Chartres. Now, nowadays, people go to the Cathedral of Chartres to look at its beautiful stained glass windows, which are medieval. Chartres is one of the best preserved, probably the best preserved medieval Gothic cathedral. In the 12th century, people went to Chartres for two reasons. One, it was a pilgrimage site. It contained the Sancta Camicia, which was a piece of fabric believed to have been worn by the Virgin Mary. So it was also on the way to the pilgrimage sites in Spain, to Santiago de Compostela. If you left Paris, you would stop, one of your stops would probably be in Chartres. But there was another reason people went there, and that was because of its school. The school of Chartres in the early 12th century was an important center of scholarship. The school was actually founded in 1020 by one Fulbert. Fulbert was himself a student of Gerbert of Aurillac, the Pope Sylvester II, whom I mentioned in the previous lecture. Before becoming Pope, he taught at the Cathedral School of Reims from about 972 until 989. Now, Gerbert, as I've already mentioned, was very interested in mathematics and astronomy. He was renowned as an excellent teacher that used models and demonstrations to teach his students. And in fact, his interest in mathematics and scientific topics was transferred to Fulbert, and from Fulbert to the school of Chartres. So Chartres put special emphasis on the quadrivium and on physica, that is, natural philosophy. The greatest period for Chartres was the first half of the 12th century, and there are three people there of importance. Bernard of Chartres, who was the master for a while in the first quarter of the century, his brother Thierry of Chartres, that we'll talk about later, but especially his student William of Conches, who wrote some very important texts. Before I go on to tell you about what Thierry and William did, let's take just a quick visit to the current Cathedral of Chartres, and I encourage you to visit it. If we go there, you will see as you approach the beautiful royal portal, the front facade of Chartres, with three entranceways. I'd want to direct your attention, though, if we were there, to the one on the right. There in the center of the tympanum is the Virgin and Child, with the child being presented to the viewer. But look away from that for a moment to the statues, a set of 14 statues that surround the inside of the arch, because these 14 statues are something very important. And I should point out that this royal portal was in fact sculpted from 1145 to 1155, so it itself comes from the high point of the Cathedral School of Chartres. Those 14 statues are divided into two groups of 7. 7 of them are personifications of, guess what? The 7 liberal arts. The other 7 are statues of classical figures who typify each one of the 7 liberal arts, right there on the facade of the cathedral. At the base of one arch is Aristotle with a lap desk writing his works. Next to, directly underneath, a statue representing logic. On the other side is Pythagoras, representing music, again with a lap desk and a set of bells above him, working on his musical treatises. And it goes all around the arch. So this is something that we can go and see today that the students at the Cathedral School of Chartres in the 12th century would have seen as well. It's a wonderful illustration of the importance of the educational program in the life of the medieval cathedral. It's right there on the facade. Well, let's turn to two of these characters. Briefly, let me say something about Thierry of Chartres. Thierry is supposed to have introduced the rota, the zero, into mathematics in Europe. He also wrote the Heptatoikon, which is a didactic work teaching the 7 liberal arts. person I'm more interested in, really, for this course is William of Conches. He wrote a work, one of several that survive, called the Dragmaticon Philosophiae. It was written between 1143, 1149, when the front facade of Chartres was being sculpted. And it's written in the form of a dialogue between a philosopher and a duke. The philosopher is clearly William himself. The duke is the Duke of Normandy, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the father of the future Henry II, King of England. Almost all of its contents, and this is important, almost all of its contents deal with natural philosophy. It implies that, in fact, this must have been the emphasis that William had for his own work. This is what he certainly emphasizes in his writings. It must have been what he emphasized in his teaching. Let me take a few minutes to go through some of the things that William of Conches talks about in the Dragmaticon. He talks first of all about the elements. He says there are 4 elements. He denies the 5th element of Aristotle, says that's not right. Remember, this is happening before most of the works of Aristotle actually make it into the mainstream in the Latin West. But he also says something very interesting. He says, and I'm quoting him here, "In each body there are minimal components that when joined together compose a single large object. And there are 4 kinds of these components, corresponding one of them to each of the 4 elements." At this, the Duke exclaims, "Why, it sounds like you're falling back on Epicurus and his doctrine that everything is made of atoms." Well, William responds in an interesting way. He says, there's no philosophical system that's so wrong that it has no truth in it whatsoever. So what he does is he says, yes, Epicurus was wrong, in fact blasphemous, by making the atoms eternal, for only God is eternal. And he was also wrong about saying that they move in a void. Nonetheless, there are these minimal particles that compose large bodies. Probably he's getting much of this from Plato's Timaeus, which you may remember developed a geometrical sort of atomism. In fact, William of Conches wrote a commentary on Plato's Timaeus. Remember, it's the only work of Plato that was available in the Middle Ages in Latin. He also talks about the earth and its shape. Spherical, of course, as any intellectual knew, but also creates a very interesting thought experiment that I should share with you. The Duke says, what happens if we bore a hole right through the middle of the earth, passing through its center so that it comes out the other side? And then we go to the hole and we drop a rock in it. What happens to the rock? And William replies, well, it falls towards the center because that's its nature, to go towards the center of the earth. As it will go past the center of the earth because it's moving very quickly, but then it will slow down and then turn around and come back and fall towards the center, rising from our point of view, overshoot it again, and then oscillate each time passing the center by less and less until finally it comes to a rest right at the center of the earth. That's the center of the universe. And it will stay suspended right there, which is, of course, correct for a slightly different reason for William than for us. But it's interesting to see him using a thought experiment like this. What else does he say? Well, he talks about the motions of the heavenly bodies, and he uses the eccentric and the epicycle to explain their motions. Now, there's something interesting about this, because remember, Ptolemy's Almagest was not known to them. Where's he getting this from? He's actually using epicycles to explain retrograde motion. Well, he tells us. He says that this is what the Chaldeans teach. The Chaldeans? The Chaldeans are Babylonians. What on earth is he talking about? Certainly not the Babylonians. What he's probably talking about is he's using the word Chaldean to refer not to the ancient inhabitants of Mesopotamia, but the contemporaneous inhabitants of Mesopotamia, namely the Arabs. And so possibly he had a text, we can probably identify what it was, the Introduction to Astrology by Abu Mashar, which means he had contact with some of the earliest astronomical translations from the Arabic coming in to Europe. Now, there's a possible, and I must stress that this is a tentative, a possible link. This particular work was translated by Adelard of Bath, who flourished from about 1116 to 1142, so an exact contemporary of William. Now, it turns out that Adelard of Bath was for a while at the Cathedral School of Laon. Well, the Cathedral School of Laon was also home to Thierry of Chartres. So they seem to have known the same people, which brings up an important point about institutions like this. They bring people together and facilitate communication that otherwise would not happen. Very important point about institutions and locations. Well, I need to read you one more line out of William of Conches. That is the last line of his text, because it starts to give us one impression of why he was doing this. He writes, "It is through knowledge of the creatures that we arrive at knowledge of the Creator." Once again, natural philosophy and Ancilla, a handmaiden to theological, spiritual pursuits. All right, well, I'm going to actually come back to William of Conches' Dragmaticon a few lectures from now. For now, I'm going to go on to our second school. That is the school that was set up at the newly founded Abbey of St. Victor, just outside of Paris. The school was public, so people came to it not just to be educated as priests, but the general public as well. People came at a variety of ages, variety of educational levels. Must have been difficult to teach because presumably you would have some students that were barely literate and others that had a fairly decent grounding in the trivium or the quadrivium. One of the masters of the school, by the name of Hugh, and he died around 1140, 1141. We don't actually know his date of birth. He wrote a text called the Didascalicon. It was basically about what should be learnt and why, and it fits into a tradition of educational writing stretching back to St. Augustine and then back to pagan Rome as well. What's of interest is that his emphasis differs significantly from that of William of Conches and the Chartres school in general. Hugh of St. Victor's text presents knowledge as redemptive of fallen man. And so knowledge has a direct spiritual consequence. Hugh of St. Victor's argument works something like this. The fall of man and the expulsion from paradise affected the entire human race in three ways. One, it affected man's relationship to God. He was now further from God. He didn't have that direct knowledge of God that Adam and Eve had in paradise. Two, it affected his ability to know things rightly. Adam had a closer knowledge of the natural world than we can have now. And three, it weakened man's body. If you read the expulsion, for example, Adam has to work and earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Women's pains are increased in childbirth. So clearly something has gone wrong with man's body as well. It's become weakened. Well, the infirmities of these three parts of man are all helped by learning of various sorts. On the one hand, the separation from God is healed with theology. Of course, also healed by the vicarious sufferings of Christ, obviously, but in an active sense, the participant, by studying theology, helps his relationship to God. Second, the intellectual weakness is cured by the liberal arts and by natural philosophy in general, learning about the world. But the most interesting one is that the weakness of man's body, according to you, is cured, or at least eased, by what he calls the mechanical arts, namely technologies. And Hugh goes to what I think is a unique extreme by naming 7 mechanical arts in analogy with the 7 liberal arts. I don't think anybody else does that. Let me read you what his 7 mechanical arts are. Fabric making. Adam and Eve were naked in the garden, but human beings don't have fur. They can't stay warm by themselves in the winter, so we need to use technology, fabric making, to address that weakness. Armament. Man doesn't have claws to protect themselves like other animals or big teeth, and so we use arms to protect ourselves. He considers commerce to be a technology. He actually calls it a kind of rhetoric. Moreover, he says something very interesting. He says that commerce reconciles nations, calms wars, strengthens peace, and turns the private good of individuals into a benefit for all. Commerce, in other words, makes us go and meet other people and learn from them. So it doesn't only supply us with the needs of the body, but also needs of the mind as well. Agriculture and hunting are other technologies he mentions, medicine, and the last one, curiously enough, is theatrics. He says that theatrics is an important part because it gives relaxation and refreshment to the mind, and it can be virtuous refreshment and relaxation. Well, schools such as these represent, in varied forms, a great flowering of Platonic thought in the Latin Middle Ages. Platonic views of knowledge in a fully Christianized context. These two schools, as I've said, were at the border of the translation movement. The school of Chartres certainly benefited from a few early contributions of Arabic in Latin, but not much. There's certainly pre-Aristotle. The arrival of Aristotle coincides with the growth of certain of the cathedral schools into that medieval institution, the university. Certainly, not all cathedral schools turned into universities. Very few of them did, but some did, in fact. The emergence and growth of the university indicates both a growth, one, in the body of knowledge that had to be taught, and two, in the cultural need, the social demand for education on a larger scale, more people. Now, the university itself was structured on the model of the medieval guild, and guilds were associations of craftsmen that came together in order to administer and to protect their rights and privileges, the rights and privileges that came with their particular crafts. So the university is itself a guild of scholars and teachers, originally. It was endowed by ecclesiastical and later by secular authorities. They were the patrons in general. But the interesting thing is that there was very little formal structure early on. Nothing essentially was owned. There were no real estate holdings, no campuses like we're used to in terms of modern universities. Even the books tended to be rented. Books were very expensive in the Middle Ages. And the university would outsource, to use the modern term, renting things from stationers and real estate agents. Now, as a result, the early university had incredible flexibility, and this was a great source of power for professors. Professors have never had this much power since. It meant that if you got annoyed by the way the local bishop was treating you, the way the local secular authorities were treating you, all you had to do was say, "We'll leave and go someplace else." And that threat was enough to strike fear into the hearts of all the local town leaders, because the students and the professors spent a lot of money. So the professors always had this wonderful threat, the threat of leaving, that they could use as a weapon. Three important universities in the 13th century were the ones at Bologna, Paris, and at Oxford. I'm going to concentrate for the remainder of this lecture on the university at Paris. Let's talk about its structure, who went there, how many people were there, and how a student progressed through the classes and what they learned. The University of Paris consisted of 4 faculties. The majority of students and teachers, masters, were concentrated in the School of Arts, the Faculty of Arts. By far the majority of the university. There were also then 3 higher faculties: law, medicine, and theology. Not unlike modern university systems with a tiered system of sort of professional school and undergraduate school. There's a similarity there. During the 1200s, the University of Paris was home to anywhere from between 1,200 to 1,500 students. So that's a huge influx of people in a town. So this is why the university became such an important part of town culture in the High Middle Ages. Also, I should mention that the Middle Ages were the origin of the town gown controversy, because both groups depended on each other, but tended not to necessarily to like each other. Students entered at an age of 14 or 15. They would attach themselves to one master, and they would spend 3 or 4 years to earn a bachelor's degree. However, it's important to point out that most students left before they ever obtained a degree. And this wasn't because they ran out of money or they got bored or they were expelled. Nothing like that. Most students came to learn just what they needed to know to go get a decent job somewhere else. Now, we, at least professors, like to think about the medieval universities as these pinnacles of selfless pursuit of knowledge, unlike the kind of students we get today that just want to go out and get a job. Unfortunately, as much as I regret to admit it, the medieval university was not so different. As I say, most left before obtaining any degree. They would learn enough reading and writing and arithmetic in order to go off and get a clerical job, a clerk's job somewhere, a notary, some kind of work in a court or the government. Well, for those who did obtain the bachelor's degree, 2 or 3 more years of study would bring you to obtain a Master of Arts degree. Now, the Master of Arts degree came with a great benefit. It gave you a particular right, which was called the jus ubique docendi, the right of teaching anywhere. That means if I'm in Paris and I get annoyed with my students, they're rotten and I can't stand them, or the local bishop annoys me, I just pack up my bags and I go to Oxford and start teaching there. Or I go to Montpellier or Bologna or some other university. In fact, generally there were in most places there was a simple examination that was given to make sure that you really had the jus ubique docendi. But in a sense, what this was, it was admission to the guild as a master. So it's very similar to craftsman guilds in that sense. Now, some students, very, very few, a very small percentage of students, proceeded on to the higher faculties to obtain a Master of Law, Medicine, or Theology. Law and medicine were certainly the two more popular of these. They were lucrative. The course of study was not as lengthy, 4 to 6 years generally to get a degree in law or medicine. Theology was by far the most rigorous program in the medieval university and required an enormous commitment on the part of the student. It required 10 to 16 years of further study to obtain a Doctor of Theology degree. Now think about this. It means that the graduate with a master's in theology, master and doctor are the same thing in the Middle Ages, would be in his 30s when he graduates finally. Now, what's the life expectancy in the Middle Ages? 42, 43, 44, somewhere like that. So it means by the time he gets out, he's middle-aged. It's also because all students and masters had to be unmarried, it means you have made the decision to be the last of your line. So you will presumably never bear children at that point. Now, all students and faculty at the university had clerical status. This is a great thing because it means that you are exempt from the punishment of civil authorities. If you commit a crime, the civil authorities have no power over you. You will be tried in an ecclesiastical court instead. Now, in the modern day, we tend to think, oh my God, ecclesiastical court, inquisition, something like that. No, no, no. You are much, much better off in an ecclesiastical court that has clear rules of evidence and clear process of law, much better than the civil courts of the Middle Ages. This was one of the reasons for the conflict between townspeople and university life, because if a crime happened between two people from each of those communities, even murder, for example, which did happen occasionally, there were riots, students are students, they tended to get drunk in the Middle Ages and get rowdy just the same way they do now. the process of law was very cumbersome, particularly for the non-university person. Well, the thing that I want to talk about in the next lecture is what happens when university culture meets Aristotelianism. The combination of those two things generates a philosophy, a method of study, a method of inquiry known as scholasticism. And scholasticism, although it tends to get a bad rap ever since the 17th century, was actually a very powerful means of studying the world, and it was the center of university curricula.